Great. Thanks, Mia, and welcome, everybody. Well, I guess we can start because it's already 4 minutes after 2, although we probably will have more people given the number of people who signed up, but we are recording this webinar so people can always look back at the recording. I start by presenting myself. I'm Martina Ferracane and I'm a Max Weber Fellow at the European University Institute. And I'm managing a project at the Institute which aims to create a digital trade integration index. And this is the 6th and last webinar of this project. So I will start by just quickly tell you a bit about this project in case some of you are joining our webinars for the first time. And then I will leave the floor to our 4 speakers that we've invited today, and I will introduce them as we go while I give them the floor. So regarding the digital trade integration project, just a few words. It is a project that we have started in July last year. Thanks to the CIVICA collaboration, which is a collaboration, inter-university collaboration that is a project that aims to foster collaboration among universities. And this project brings together 4 universities in Europe, which are the UI, the London School of Economics, RT, and Bocconi University. On top of this inter-university collaboration, we also have in this project a collaboration with 3 UN agencies, UNESCAP, UNECLAC, and UNECA. We're also collaborating with the ISAIP think tank, the TISA network in Australia, and the DCO Center based in Saudi Arabia. So it's really a project that has kept growing, and the objective of the project is first of all to create a network of people working on digital trade so that we can really have a place to interact, organize exchanges like this one, which bring together also different perspectives. The second objective is to create a database of measures that affect digital trade. We have already started collecting measures related to this, and we aim to release our database with at least 90 countries in May this year. And the third objective is to create and develop an index on digital trade integration based on the data collected in the database. And for this, we are getting feedback and receiving support through these webinars, finalizing the development of the methodology, and we aim to release the index in September this year. So this is shortly what we're doing with this project. And as I was saying, this webinar is the 6th webinar that aims to feed and provide input to the methodology that we are using for the digital trade integration index. So, well, that's it about the index and the introduction. The speakers have received our draft index, and just to tell you quickly, it is an index which covers over 60 types of policies in different areas. They go from tariffs to investment, online transactions, movement of data, etc. So the idea is to get from the speakers also comments on this methodology they have already seen, and in general comments on what we are missing in the index that can provide an African perspective and make sure that the issues and the sensitivities in the developing world, and mainly from Africa, which is a very special way of also approaching negotiations at the multilateral level on this, can be taken into account in our index. That's a bit the idea of this webinar. And to do this, well, we have 4 great speakers. I will just quickly introduce them and then give the floor to our first speaker, which is going to be Geoffroy. So we're going to have Geoffroy Goupier. Is Economic Affairs Officer from the UN Economic Commission for Africa. I will leave the floor to you for around 10 minutes to provide comments. The other speakers which will follow are Torbjørn Fredriksson from UNCTAD. Then we have Shamira Ahmed, who is a senior economist and trade specialist at Research ICT Africa. And then we have Tunda Fufamfwa from Managing Director at KITSCO that will provide us a private sector perspective to conclude our discussion. I leave the floor to Geoffroy, and in case anyone has also questions after Geoffroy's intervention, please feel free to come in and start sharing comments on the chat, because this webinar is meant to be very informal. So feel free to start commenting on the chat and to ask questions right after the presentation of Geoffroy. Thanks, Geoffroy. The floor is yours.
Yes, many thanks, Martina. Many thanks for the floor. I'm very happy to be here to present, to talk about the digital trade integration. And let's start by saying that the index that that European University Institute is collecting is part of our all digital trade regulatory integration. And this initiative that we launched, when I say we, I talk about ECA, Economic Commission for Africa. This initiative that we launched at the end of 2020 have the key objective of assessing the readiness of African countries to effectively engage in digital trade and e-commerce. How it's work? We first train national experts on collection and compilation of digital trade data, and after that, after giving to this researcher the tools to make the research, they collect and compile and also analyze digital trade data. Which information we collect? We collect two indicators. The first one is digital services trade restriction, and the second one is digital trade integration that we will talk about in a few minutes. And after the collection, we resume the opportunity, the challenge, and the recommendation that come from the two indicators in a national draft that we call country profile to give all the information on this information. The information collected is very important for us, for the member of African continent, for the member of Economic Commission for Africa, in that sense that we are going to launch the third phase of negotiation of the African Continental Free Trade Area. And this third phase will focus on digital trade at all, but principally in e-commerce, and we will launch, actor government will launch a protocol about e-commerce in this third phase. And second interest of the database is to expand in the coverage of African countries in OECD digital services trade. And thirdly, we will use the digital trade integration index that are collected in partnership with European University Institute to complement our index about trade integration, and to add a digital dimension of to this index. And of course, data will be available for all the researchers who will want to use it to analyze digital trade integration in Africa. So the first database collected is digital service trade restriction, and it is collected around 5 pillars, which are modeled, which are based, on DSTRI, OECD DSTRI, and the 5 pillars are infrastructure, electronic transaction, payment system, intellectual property right, and other barrier. What we find is very interesting in that sense that we find that most of African countries have reduced restrictive measure to digital trade, starting from 2014 to 2020. Second conclusion or second observation that we can do after collection is that some African countries are not part of international agreements, causing the high restrictive score for intellectual property, for example. And also, many restrictions to trade across African countries are found in infrastructure, meaning lack of provision of data and other infrastructure requirements. So yes, this is the result that we get from the first database, showing that it is an encouraging result in that sense that most of African countries have reduced restrictive measure in terms of regulation to digital trade. The second indicator that we collect is digital trade integration. We collect this indicator also around 11 pillars, going from tariff and trade defense to online sale and transaction. And what we find here also is very interesting, as African countries are moderately integrated in terms of digital trade. The bar in the graph represents the contribution of each pillar to the value of the indicator, and at the right hand side you have the value of the indicator, which are represented by the decreasing line. So yes, African countries are moderately integrated in terms of digital trade. And if we compare, and maybe Martina can add more things about it, if we compare those countries, African countries, with Asia Pacific one, they appear to be less integrated. So second message that we can draw from this collection is that most of African countries have a lack of adequate data policy, data protection, consumer law, and this appears to be the biggest impediment to digital trade integration in the covered country. We have the example, for example, of domestic data policy, which contributes, which have a huge part of the index calculated. So turning to the methodology, just a few words before the end. We see that the pillar cover most of the key measures concerning digital trade. Maybe it will be more interesting to discuss the relevance of the use ponderation for Africa. And here I give two examples. Second one is that when you take pillar online sales, for example, we have 0.30 for restriction to online sales and 0.20 for restriction to e-payment. And it seems to me that these two elements of the online sales pillar are two sides of the same coin. So maybe we can give more discussion. We can have more discussion about the weights used to construct the index. And also one of the measures to promote digital trade integration could be to improve data protection legislation to regulate cross-border data flow. Because we constate that serious barrier to cross-border payment in Africa make the online trade of product very difficult. And if you analyze South-South agreement, for example, we can see that 13 of the agreements, 13 of the South-South agreements have provision on cross-border data flow. So it is very low, and we can improve this measure. We can promote this measure in the context of digital trade integration. Many thanks, Martina, and also many thanks, colleagues, for the floor.
Many thanks, Geoffroy. Well, the results are very interesting, and I myself have not seen it in this way. So it's very interesting to see the different pillars and what matters most. And what is interesting, I think, also in Africa is that there is a lot on content access, restrictions. So there is a tendency of the government to restrict what users can access online, and there has been also a lot of events of internet shutdowns, something which personally I've only seen being used in Africa, which is also, I think, a big component. Well, regarding I will not comment on your proposals. I guess maybe it makes sense to hear from all the speakers, and then we can go into the responding to the suggestions on the methodology. So I leave the word to Torbjörn from UNCTAD. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Martina, and thanks also to Geoffroy for his first intervention. I must confess to start with, that this is the first time actually I'm exposed to this initiative, so I have missed the previous 5 workshops, so I may be repeating things that others have been saying and so on and so forth. But what I've done is basically to start out from what Martina, you sent me in this Excel list of the final index, which is, I think, the 11 indicators rather than the many more, I think, in what the first presentation suggested. But I don't know if there are different.
No, sorry, on this, well, is always 11 pillars, but then within the pillars, there are all the indicators, about 16 total. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Anyway, so thanks again for this opportunity to discuss this work on digital trade integration. And as I understand, for this particular webinar, at least, it's focusing on Africa. I do not plan to be very lengthy in my comments, but rather highlight some perhaps conceptual issues which on which I would love to see some more information, if possible. My first point would concern some of the concepts that are used in the list of indicators that I looked at, in order to be able to, I think, properly interpret the final results from the collection of data and also the calculation of the index results. I think it'll be important to clearly define what is meant in this project. For example, I would be very careful, frankly, and this is a bit problematic perhaps because that's the overall theme of the whole initiative, with the use of the term digital trade. Because now, as you know, this has been defined by a number of leading international organizations as comprising either cross-border trade, that is the result of things ordered online, or services that are digitally delivered. It's either ordered online and traded, or it's digitally delivered. And this is what has been defined as digital trade, which would mean that, for instance, buying or selling ICT goods would not be part of digital trade as such unless they were ordered online. But however, I think if the project would like to have a more broad scope for this and to avoid the confusion there that might arise, maybe you would talk about trade in the digital economy rather than digital trade. So, for instance, in the first category, reference is made to ICT imports, ICT products, and to digital goods. So, my digital goods. Also, when referring to the ITA, ITA covers various merchandise that have been classified as ICT goods, but also other goods. So again, it might be useful to clarify whether the focus here is on ITA covered goods or on ICT goods specifically. In the category 2, you talk about digital goods and services, which I think will be important to be defined. Category 3, you say you talk about the sectors that are relevant for digital trade, and I just wonder which are these sectors, because I think there are quite a few. Category 5, what does lack of deregulation mean? Does that mean complete monopoly in all telecom segments, or is there a range of this didn't really come through from what I had. Category 9, define digital goods, and category 11, I just wonder what kind of restrictions that are considered here, because it's not really clear. Okay, my second point concerns how the index will eventually be interpreted. It seems to me that the methodology used will suggest that the higher the scores, the higher the restrictiveness, and therefore the lower the level of trade integration. And I think this builds on the approach that the OECD originally took, and UNCTAD also did a similar exercise based on the OECD approach, but looking at investment restrictiveness instead. And I think that this is pretty straightforward when it comes to merchandise trade, but would perhaps caution about too simplistic assessments of restrictions applied in the case of services. I mean, proper licensing procedures in some sectors and regulations in others may be very important, to ensure a competitive environment or to address other potential risks in the services context. So again, I would like to know how the index handles this in terms of having a good regulatory regime as opposed to no regulatory regime, for example, and which would be more desirable from a development perspective there. And moreover, since this is about trade in a broad sense, how do you interpret the findings of this? Are they equally relevant for export integration, or are they mainly looking at openness to imports and foreign investment into the country? Okay, I'll get back to that. Finally, my third point concerns the focus here. It seems that when data are collated for each country covered by the index, if we look at trade regimes in general, sort of. However, as this part of the index is to consider especially trade integration in Africa, to what extent does do the indicators factor in regional trade preferences, for instance, at the level of the East African Community or SADC or ECOWAS? And I think this would be very useful to know, for instance, in the lead up to the negotiations that will get underway under the African Continental Free Trade Area. Finally, just a few remarks on what we do in UNCTAD. We undertake what we call the e-trade readiness assessments, which are not mainly focusing just on the trade aspect, but more generally the ability of countries to engage in and participate and benefit from e-commerce. And that will bring in some of the issues that are also brought in here, like the payment situation, various legal and regulatory issues, availability of skills, availability of finance for entrepreneurs in the digital sector, and so on and so forth. And I think the national quality of the e-commerce ecosystem, I think, is very important also to consider when you're looking at the ability to countries to take advantage of open trade policies, for instance. And I think that may be going too far than what you're trying to do with this exercise, but I thought I should mention it because it may be useful as a cross-reference at some stage in the work. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks. This is a lot of very interesting comments, and I will not respond to them right now because it will take 10 minutes, but I have noted all of them, so I will definitely respond because these are all points we thought about. So it's, and especially there are some on which I still have some doubts, so it will be great to exchange a moment on this. But well, before we get to that, I leave the floor to Shamira Ahmed from Research ICT Africa.
Okay, thanks, Martina. I just want to start by saying that all the opinions are my own and do not necessarily reflect Research ICT Africa's position on the matter. So just talking briefly about priorities for digital trade integration in Africa, there are obviously quite a lot that Geoffrey and Tobon have mentioned, that there are a lot of issues and there are a lot of challenges and priorities that need to be addressed in order to actually have digital trade integration. I'll just highlight three. The first one would be harmonization of data governance and data protection regulation, harmonization of technical standards for interoperability of soft and hard ICT infrastructure, and also interoperability of data quality, and also harmonization of regional and cross-regional financial infrastructure integration projects. And in terms of the regional integration initiatives, I think having regional integration in terms of payments is quite important for e-commerce and digital trade in general. For example, initiatives like the Single Euro Payments Area, that would definitely help digital trade in Africa. And there are already small pilots in Africa at a regional economic community level. For example, through the Southern African Development Community and the recently launched Pan-African Payment and Settlement System. So I think also considering some of the payment aspects of digital trade in the African context as an indicator might be helpful. I think you've captured some of those challenges or issues in Pillar 11, which is online sales and transactions, but I think you can still highlight legal and regulatory frameworks or harmonization, contractual aspects, and certain back-end arrangements. For example, commitments in the World Trade Organization's GATS in terms of payments, electronic payments services, or cross-border payments as well, or even regulation under the Bank of International Settlements. So maybe that might be helpful just from like regional integration from the payment aspects of digital trade. And then I think another indicator that I think might be expanded on would be in the Pillar 3, in terms of foreign investments in sectors relevant for digital trade. There are quite a few digital services tax laws that have popped up in Africa. And these are like indirect taxes that cover digital services internally within a country. And a few countries have some form of like direct digital services tax that applies to non-residents with no physical presence in their respective countries. Last time I was updated on the list, or I kept up to date with the activities in terms of digital services tax laws, it was Kenya, Nigeria, Tunisia, and Zimbabwe. So maybe that also might be helpful because it would definitely impact restrictiveness in terms of foreign investments in sectors relevant for digital trade. And then my last comment is on Pillar 5, which is on telecom infrastructure and competition. I think given the realities of the African continent, there needs to be more developmental and enabling considerations that reflect the realities in many African countries. So I think you'd have some way to include things like electrification and energy access deficits, and what is needed for meaningful connectivity to actually participate in digital trade, in a digital trade landscapes. So you need to look at access to appropriate devices, affordable data, fast, high quality internet connection. I think these are really crucial. You need to have meaningful connectivity and electricity. If you don't have these, then essentially countries can't even participate fully in the data economy and in digital trade. Yeah, and those were my few comments. I can add, I'll send you links for some of the databases that might be helpful that I saw. And also just adding to the payment aspects of digital trade, it also overlaps with the connectivity issues in terms of people using a mobile phone for entrepreneurship or for business activity, and also the digital divide, and also digital identity issues. You need to have a digital identity and financial inclusion for you to interact in a digital payment system and therefore have an inclusive trade ecosystem in different African countries. So you need to have like regulatory convergence in the payment system that complements connectivity issues. And like there needs to be overlapping considerations. It can't just be digital trade in isolation, especially in the context of African countries where we actually don't have the enablers to have an efficient digital trade system. So beyond, I know this is just for trade and like regulation, but you also need to have consideration of enabling factors for digital trade in Africa. Thank you.
Well, great. Many thanks, Shamira. And these are definitely the kind of indicators that we need to add to the index. So many thanks for pointing out some of them. Well, I leave the word now to Tunde from FAWA. He has wide experience in the private sector, so he can bring us a bit of the private sector perspective into the discussion. So the word is yours.
Thank you, Martina. Tunde Fafunwa here. A pleasure and glad to be able to contribute from my private sector experience background, but also from my public sector advisory, including ECA. I do think that the overall, this approach and index is very important in terms of providing guidance, particularly in the public sector, and helping to rank countries and show what the situation is so that there's a benchmark for improvement. I've had to revise my comments several times as each of the speakers spoke. This is one of the challenges of being last, as they have all made very significant points, from Shamira to Torben to Jeffrey. So perhaps what I'll just focus on is and suggest is a context for the index, and perhaps to suggest that it appears to be skewed towards large corporations and entities and foreign investment, which is obviously an important and significant and critical sector. But I would also suggest that the micro, small, medium enterprise segment, which actually makes up sometimes up to 80% of jobs on the continent, 50% of the actual economy, when you take into account the informal economy, is a vital sector that is not adequately represented in the index. And specifically in those areas and some of the measures that I think need to be strengthened. Again, they were mentioned by the colleagues, but perhaps I'd like to emphasize them, are some of the aspects required for small and medium businesses to participate in the digital cross-border trade. Those would, of course, include and are very focused on payments, because the ability to make payments from a small business perspective is much more limited than a corporate side. And again, this was mentioned by Shamira and others. The PAP system from Afri-Exim Bank, very impressive because it is continent-wide, it is multi-currency, supports transactions that might not even occur in dollars, but again, primarily skewed towards the corporate environment. So ability of small and micro businesses to pay and to manage the multi-currency environment, I think is critical. There are other related elements to that. Again, Shamira mentioned this, including identification and credit. So again, for larger businesses, well-established identity is not an issue. They participate in the market as entities and are recognized as such. But for this micro small business, it all relates back to the individual identity and credit. And identification is an issue. How do you prove who you are when you are a individual or operating a small, micro, medium business? So identification is part of infrastructure as one of your indicators, I think is very critical. The third item I'd like to mention is would come under platforms, but I don't think it's adequately covered, which is platforms. So, market platforms, e-commerce platforms, and the availability of those are, again, critical for micro and small, medium businesses that have to participate via a market, as opposed to being able to do business online, individually as larger corporations. So in that regard, I think that the indicators that are most significant in this area, I'll just pick one or two, are the trade restrictions on 9, which would be difficult for small and medium businesses to navigate. And also Number 11, I think, is particularly relevant to the comments I've made for small businesses. So those two, I think, would be most relevant. As a related note, maybe I just make a couple of comments on some of the things that are happening from a data perspective. The African Union is in the process of finalizing a data governance framework that could be extremely useful, of course, as it would be continent-wide and help to provide a guidance and framework for data content, would deal with the IPR rules, including the, data restrictions, privacy, the issues around nationalizing data and whether that can be used or accessed outside countries. And a separate initiative also from the African Union on interoperability that primarily focuses on digital ID, but also more broadly on interoperability. And I think those two initiatives, of course, along with the e-commerce protocol that we are very much anticipating from the African Continental Free Trade Area, which was part of phase 3 with a target for the end of last year, but clearly is delayed, are going to be very relevant going forward in the next couple of years. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thanks a lot, Tunde. These are all really great comments. And well, what I suggest is that first I can quickly respond to all of them. I would just put them in groups of issues. And then what we could do is, I don't know if there is also someone else from the team that wants to comment on these comments we received. And if you have any questions, feel free to start raising your hands or writing your question in the chat. In the meantime, I start giving some comments back on what we heard. So the first thing, starting from the big perspective on digital, the use of the word digital trade and what we include there and why we're using that. I think the point raised by Torbjörn is very relevant in terms of the fact that we are really giving a very broad definition of digital trade, and that is what we intended in the first place. What we're trying to do is really take into account everything that can impact our country, can integrate through digital trade. And that's why we are including ICT goods, services, FDI, movement of data, all the kind of components that we think can have an impact on the capacity and ability of countries to engage in digital trade are taken into account. And for this, I worked on a list of what we consider to be ICT goods. We have here Alejandro, who is finalizing this list. We started from ITA 1, ITA 2, but we are really trying to be as wide and comprehensive as possible. That's the idea. And so we are looking at the literature on how to define a ICT good, and we are one of the annexes of our methodology will be the list of goods that we define as ICT goods, which is very broad. It's ITA 2 plus. Regarding the sectors relevant for digital trade, that's the same thing. We are going to have an annex on what do we consider sectors relevant for digital trade, and also in this case we are trying to be very broad and try to take into account not only online services, which of course we consider, but also manufacturing of ICT goods, for example, telecommunication sector, and of course computer services and all those that are more obvious. So we're really trying to be as comprehensive as possible there, and also in this case we're going to have a list, an annex with the list of sectors. And the idea is to be broad, but also be transparent, so people know what we are including there and why we are doing it. So this is about definitions. Yeah, and then well, on perhaps on the integration part. So this is where we're putting most of our efforts on trying to move from a simple restrictiveness approach, which is what we see also at the OECD and what we had also worked on in the past. And this trying to make this move to integration is not simple, because we are trying to include all components and all policies, but also variables in the country which could support actively the integration of the country in the global digital trade ecosystem. And this is where we are still working on. And in this, when we talk about integration, we can include issues like connectivity, we can include skills, electrification, as Shamira mentioned. So we're trying to take and include as many variables as possible, but also we're trying to make a selection there. And what we would like to do is to include variables which are already collected by the UN and different agencies of the UN, so that we simply every year add them to our index, and they help us to create and take into account the integration part. And of course, then we include all these measures such as the data protection laws, consumer protection law, all those measures which are important to promote integration of the country with the rest of the world, and to make also citizens feel safe to conduct trade online. But this is something we need to, of course, like try to work more on, and that's why, and there I link to the comment also, Torbjörn, on the regional part. What we want to do is to start with this index, which will be a global index covering now at the start already 90 countries, but then slowly focusing on regional indexes and trying to look into regional integration, because what we're seeing from our research, and it's really great to be able to work with different regions because you start seeing patterns. So what we're seeing is that there are definitely areas in the regions which are more integrated, but not simply in one region, but also across regions with certain type of agreements. So what we would like to do is to put next to our index on digital trade integration regional indexes that try to look farther into the regional or plurilateral integration in certain areas. And this will be the next step of this project, but this will be next year. So we'll start with the first index, but definitely we want to look into regional integration, and we want to take into account FTAs, commitments taken in FTAs, but this would require a big effort, but that's the direction we want to go to. Then moving more into specific type of questions. On licensing, on this, just for licenses, what we are just considering is whether there is a requirement to have a license in order to conduct an activity online, which could be provide online news or social media or all of this. And for this, we don't see why a license should be something too good in a way, in the sense that like the simple fact of requiring a license in order to operate online seems to us always to be a restriction somehow. But if you have like suggestions on that front, of course, let us know. Of course, we're not considering licenses in the financial sector because these are like obvious, and we are not.
What about a mobile operator?
We are not, so licensing for telecom, we are not considering this a problem unless it is a strict license that is discriminatory, there are complaints. So just a license for operating as a telecom operator or offering mobile services, we don't include it. So we include licenses for, we makes also some examples, online news, social media, and other type of services provided online. The only two type of licenses we're not including is for financial services online, because of course you should have a license to provide the financial services. And the second is a telecom. But for example, for VPN services, we consider this to be a restriction because it's not a common practice. But if you think that it's not that we should take into account other things, or this is not correct. So we are really open to change that. Just to move quickly to the other comments, taxation is a really interesting topic, and initially it was in this index, but we removed it because there was all this discussion about updating the international agreements on tax, and it's not very, like, taxing digital services was a problem that became kind of normal. So it's still not really clear what is the good common practice there, but there are some things that for sure would be a problem. For example, taxing data, and there are a couple of countries doing it, and we might consider including this. But yeah, we were scared of, we didn't want to take sides into this discussion. I wanted to wait until there was a kind of international common, like, best practice before including it. But please, Shamira, if you already think that there could be something we can already include, we will definitely do that. Some questions I throw back to you instead, to all the speakers, because you have provided some areas that we should include, for example, harmonization, interoperability, platforms like convergency, all this. But our problem, of course, is always how do we measure this? Like, what indicator can we include, which is we can find for all these countries in a way which is not reasonably doable, and that can in which we can find a kind of an agreement across different actors. Well, that's it. I responded to, I hope, most of the comments raised, and in the meantime, we have a lot of hands, so I leave it there for now. Thanks. Maybe we take these 3 questions we have, and then we give the speakers the opportunity to respond. So Narno first, then Eric and Umar.
Thank you, Martina. A great event. Very interesting to listen to the comments from outside experts and also to your reactions. And indeed, this is a work in progress, and it builds upon important work done before, but of course it can always be improved. And it's great that there is this openness to do so this year, what remains of the project. But of course we want to get a version 1.0 out, and then next year you can continue working on this. Just one quick comment on the dashboards. You may take in consideration that the ITC, the International Trade Center, has produced a Africa e-marketplace monitor dashboard, and which has data for all 55 African countries, and laying out the presence of B2C and C2C goods marketplaces. So it's a tool that has already been constructed, and I think you could quite easily include an indicator in terms of the number of marketplaces, for example, per million of population or something like that. That could be a proxy for the presence of these indicators. And indeed, I very much agree with the comments made that it's important to consider certain aspects for SME access to digital services. So I think that's an area where we might consider 1 or 2 other indicators in addition to the one on marketplaces, like those proposed by the different contributors. Thanks.
Eric, you want to go next?
Yeah, I had a question for Torbjorn related to the definitional issues, because I am aware of what the UNCTAD and the OECD have developed in terms of the manual of digital trade. And I'm also hearing your comment about definitions of maybe goods should be out, or maybe one should make a distinction between digital ordered and digital delivered. But then if I look at the manual, I can also see that, for example, I mean, there is digital ordered, in which like goods are part of. But then if you look at the list of digital delivered, there's a whole wide range of services for which, I mean, they can be provided over the internet, and maybe sort of, the international organizations would classify them as digital services trade, but it's maybe also, according to some other people, a bit of a stretch in terms of our actual architectural services or other associated business services. Really, can they really be defined as digital services? So how would one go around this issue? The more so, because if I read further in the manual, that platforms, for example, are excluded from these two categories. And so there are a third category, which can cover, of course, services and goods. And so for me, I mean, I put then a question mark, how one should go around this to effectively adhere to, agreed definitions by international organizations, and how and why would certain aspects like be included, because like the platforms is part of the index, goods too, but what are your thoughts then, whether it should not be included, or what is your argument there?
Great, thanks, Eric. Well, I will also get to the question from Umar, and then we go back to the speakers, and then we have more questions. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I am Kabanda Umar, and I'm a policy leadership fellow from Uganda in the School of Transnational Governance in EY. So I'm interested to talk about three things, and the first one is on cross-border trade. I would suggest that you disintegrate transborder trade and create two indicators, one for formal and the other for informal. Why? Because if you look at about 78%, according to the International Labour Organization, you get to see that African trade, as emphasized by Tunde, it's mostly informal. And if we fail to understand how to capture data from the informal sector and we talk about only the formal, then we lose the meaning of the actual trade. So disintegrating data from cross-border trade, informal, formal, it will be a good idea. And then the second one is we need, in everything that is being done, we always need the gender component. Having gender disaggregated data or having an indicator on aspects of gender, so that we can have data that is sensitive to the needs of the different traders within the continent. During my few interactions in the trade discussions, I discovered that most of the informal traders across borders are women. So you may discover that most of these women need a certain kind of service based on the indicator that you come up with, which will inform the the African Union Initiative on Free Trade. And then they come up with initiatives that can facilitate the actual integration of trade as envisioned from the index. And the last one is to emphasize the importance of taxation. And there's no debate about this, because looking at a country like Uganda, where I come from, I've come to realize that some people may resist or hesitate to use online trading, or they may resist sending money through mobile money because of the charge that is attached there. So what is most important is not to downplay how important this is, but to investigate more in which countries is this happening and how does it happen? How could it in a way inform more the aspect of taxation and facilitation of the actual people in the anticipated trade by using the indicators that you are suggesting. So I commend you for the great work you're doing, and I'm very happy to participate in this discussion. Though it's my first meeting that I got a chance to be in. I didn't know about the others, but I hope I'll get to know more.
Absolutely, and you're also here in Florence, so you're most welcome to join also in presence. Laurent, before I give the word to you, I will leave your comment to the second round. So we kick off with you, and I leave the word to the speakers, starting from Torbjörn, with his hand raised.
Yes.
Thank you very much. And a few comments then. Maybe first on Nano's point about the ITC mapping of e-marketplaces in Africa. Is a great tool. Again, it just needs to be clear what this index is about, because I am quite convinced that almost everyone on the marketplaces that they have there, with maybe with a few exceptions, are domestic in nature. So they are serving each market. Because cross-border e-commerce in Africa is still extremely limited, and most of these platforms are serving the national markets. And for us, when we look at the ability to participate in digital trade, we think that's a very important component. But if you do that, then there may be other factors that you also want to include in the index that are also sort of focusing on the domestic market and the readiness to sort of do digital stuff. You know, when we talk about e-commerce use in Northern Europe, for instance, about 80% of people are already buying online. In most African countries, the level is less than 10%. So we're talking about different kind of environments completely here, and that means that there may be certain issues that may be more relevant in an African context than would be in a European context. For instance, in the payments area, the mobile money aspect needs to be somehow reflected, but I don't think it is, because it's mentioned e-payment, credit cards, and other forms of online payments. For mobile money, if that is not really reflected in, I think we will not really be giving it a fair situation. Eric, very good questions. I think here we need to understand the objective of the handbook of measuring digital trade. It's really to make it possible to put numbers on what we call digital trade. Because as long as we talk about digital trade in a very loose way, we're speaking past each other, because someone has something in mind when they talk about digital trade, another person has something else in mind. So when you ask, but this distinction between digital trade and digital services, can you really call something a digital service if it's architectural or business? The point here is that, in fact, they don't even call them digital services. They call them digitally delivered services. So the question is here, if you can deliver it over digital means, then it is sometimes called digitally deliverable service. And because very few countries are actually measuring how much is actually digitally delivered. And only when you know exactly how much that is, you can say these were digitally delivered services. We have helped to develop a methodology to measure that. But so far, to my knowledge, only 2 countries have used it so far, and that's India and Costa Rica. So they can actually say, for each of these architectural and business services, they can say X% was digitally delivered, X% was delivered by someone traveling to the country, delivering the services in person, for instance, or having someone coming to them to get the services delivered. So, and this thing about the platform thing in the handbook is just making the point that these platforms can be an intermediary for facilitating digitally delivered services or digitally ordered services. And it's not a question of whether they are part of various services products. So it's just to conceptually understand how this system is constructed. That's why also these data flows were not part of the concept of digital trade, because only when you put a number, a monetary value to this, it should be recognized as trade as such, because if it's zero value, then it's just information flows. So I hope that somehow explain what we try to do with that exercise. It still is not easy to actually collect the information to put the numbers in place, but it's just to have a conceptual idea of what we're talking about when we talk about it. So that I would just encourage you to talk about trade in the digital space or digital economy or something like that, rather than digital trade, because it's only been defined in the past couple of years. So it's normal that we have been talking about digital trade loosely, but it can be confusing. Thank you.
Thanks. Any other speakers wants to come back on some of the points raised? Then maybe I give the word to Laurent, and then we go back again.
Yes, good afternoon to everybody. Since there are a few newcomers, I would wish to very briefly introduce myself. I am from Bocconi University. We are partners with EUI in this project, and under the brilliant leadership of EUI, we as Bocconi University try to give also our support. So I am very much interested by the presentations that were made, and in particular, I just have one question for Geoffroy and for Torben, and also to a certain extent to Shamira, on how, on the, I understand you analyzed a lot of trans-border parameters. I understand, especially in the case of Geoffroy, that there was a very much in-depth analysis of national parameters. How, especially in the studies of Geoffroy, is intellectual property considered? Since I'm more or less in our team in charge of this area, or taking care of this area very closely. So how do you consider the flexibilities in the patents, trademarks, copyright laws, in the protection of rights that affect intellectual property in digital trade, and that promote, by the way, digital trade thanks to intellectual property? So the question is initially to Geoffroy, but it may also be to others.
Just on this, we also have a question in the chat from Andrea about export control regulations. And so before leaving the word to Geoffroy, just quickly on Andrea's comment on export, we simply include the export bans and export restrictions among the policies that we look into. That's the only way in which we do it. And also we take into account cases in which there are screenings of products for national security, for example. So this is how we take that part into account. Regarding Laurent's comment, so Geoffroy has presented two things, basically the OECD index and our index in Africa. So on the part on IP, basically is our index, what they have collected. So it's exactly our measures. And on the other front is the OECD digital STRI. So I don't know if Geoffroy, you want to say something on this?
Yes, this is what I'm going to say, that maybe you can give more information about the digital integration part, and I will complete, but it's not very different, but I will complete with the OECD one. So I don't know if you... Yeah,
for our part, just also maybe for the others who have not seen the methodology, what we have, and this is evolved since we did the study with Africa. We look at patents, and when it comes to patents, we look at two things, which is application and enforcement side. We look at whether there are restrictions on these two parts of the process. We then look at copyrights, and for copyrights, we look at whether there are exceptions in the copyright law, general exceptions on fair dealing and fair use, and also we look at whether there is a high level of piracy of copyrighted products. Then we have included an entry on trade secrets, whether there is a law in the country on trade secrets, and this is basically the new methodology proposed by Laurent. We then look at whether there is mandatory disclosure of trade secrets for the companies, and in that case, we look at whether the disclosure is like basically companies have to disclose and provide the governments with their source code or algorithms or whatever without any protection, or we give a lower score if the governments commit not to share and use the information they have got access to. And finally, we are linking our IP pillar to a variable that we are taking from another data set, which is the WEF, the World Economic Forum database on Global Competitiveness Index, and we take the index on IP, and we also reference to that. So we have 8 measures in the IP pillar. While for the OECD, I'm not sure. I was trying to check their methodology now on the IP front, but I don't remember exactly what they put on IP.
For OECD, the measure on intellectual property rights capture whether foreign firms have access to national trademark registration and protection on a non-discriminatory basis. They check the discriminatory treatment for protection of copyright and related rights. Also, they check if intellectual property rights are enforced. Judicial or administrative enforcement, provisional measure, if provisional measures are available, and also criminal enforcement proceeding and penalties are available. So this is how they are designed in the OECD.
Yeah, I just copied their text definition. So basically, they cover also trademarks, and then the redress. That's the difference with our index.
Yeah,
which we decided to exclude. Yeah,
it's no big issue, because if we were to enter into the trademark issue like OECD did, and their methodology precedes ours in terms of time, there is no. This would not be much interesting, because we would need to move then to domain names, which are interesting for digital trade. So basically, ours doesn't. It has more parameters on other things, such as trade secrets, and less. There is no trademark, but trademark here is far less interesting at this stage, for at least for the step one of the project. So it's no problem. We are not in contradiction. We are just slightly focused differently.
There is another comment for Geoffroy about whether these indexes, this data is already available.
Okay, not yet, but we are going to launch a platform where we will make available all the data covered in the initiative, going from OECD 1 to the one that we collect with you, Martina, and the European University Institute. So yes, in few months it will be public.
Great. We have like 5 more minutes, and well, I just wanted to quickly also respond to Umar that all the things you have raised are very relevant, of course, on gender and taxation. The part on the informal economy will be, I think, very hard to include. We have to think how and whether we should take this into account. And on the gender side, something interesting could be when we talk about readiness, include also some gender variable. Eric, please.
Yeah, I just kept on thinking, and I'm going back to Torbjörn about this definition issue, and I'm sorry to bug you on this one. But I mean, and I just want to hear your thoughts about this. So what if one sort of sees digital trade from a digital technology perspective? So you look at one digital technology, and I look at the ecosystem of what is needed, basically. I mean, not to justify, again, you would need goods or whatever, you need services, investments. But is that somehow also a way to think about it? Or is it also something that, the people involved in the handbook for a follow-up is thinking about this? Or because it is large digital trade, and often it sort of connects to digital technologies. Like if one, for example, thinks about platform, but there is evolving issues in digital technologies that are sort of purely cross-border. I mean, data is one of them, but the Commission is doing a lot of sort of anticipates on a lot of sort of digital technologies that are coming. So how would such an approach sort of be perceived by you or people involved in that project to define digital trade?
Can I respond there immediately, Martina? Okay, I think it boils down to the question of what you want to do and what you're trying to achieve. But my understanding here is that the goal is to look at trade flows somehow between countries, whether it's within Africa or between Africa and the rest of the world, and so on and so forth. And you want to see whatever you want to talk about, whether it is digital trade according to what others have defined, or if you want to talk about something else. But I'm just saying that if you want to talk about something else, I just think you should call it something else than just digital trade, or you say digitally enabled trade through certain technology. It depends on what you want to do with this exercise. So I think it's really up to the team that is defining this index to determine what is the objective of it. And my understanding is that you want to see, just looking at the various categories and the indicators, it seems to be what could be restrictions or enablers in the actual trade flows. That's the main focus, not really to see to what extent are players in that country really equipped to engage in these opportunities. You see, this is the framework, and then it's a question of, do you have the capabilities, do you have the skills, do you have the infrastructure, do you have everything that is needed to actually participate? It's like in any trade situation. You can have zero tariffs on manufacturing goods trade, but you may still not be able to export anything because you don't know how to produce it. So I think it's by going into various technologies and so on, I think you go in a very you go into an area where we probably will, number one, not be able to put up much numbers if you want to put it into an index, because there are not good metrics to really look at. I don't know. We haven't. I think we have, when we discussed this, the definition of digital trade, we try to be technology neutral, just to distinguish, is it physically or digitally delivered? Then what kind of technologies are involved in facilitating that? That was like a secondary aspect, so that was not really featuring in the discussion. But maybe you're onto something interesting to expand this work now. We are in a revision mode now for the second edition of it, so, and that will take a while.
Okay. No, yeah, it was a question going beyond the index. It was really a question about, like, what are you people thinking about this? Yeah, just for my own sort of, I guess, curiosity.
Okay. I will put our latest digital economy report in the chat, and that will reflect a bit our thinking in that area.
Okay, thank you.
Wonderful. Well, since we started 4 minutes late, I will just take this last question from Lee, and then I just leave the word to the speakers if they want to give one last comment, and then we conclude the meeting. Lee, the floor is yours.
Hi, yeah, just a brief reaction to the discussion between Eric and Torbjorn. And on a lot of the technologies that are supporting digital transformations in digital trade, I would think they would be captured, a lot of them, because the technology ends up being supplied in many cases by computer service suppliers or telecom suppliers who adapt the technology and then make it available to users. So wouldn't a lot of the technologies be captured by the ICT data, which is, most of it is by its definition, it's digitally supplied.
Yeah, can I just add briefly to Lee's point there? I think if you take the case of 3D printing, which is sometimes causing confusing in the minds of people how to classify, but in principle, you have to buy the printer, which is a good. You have to get the material to print on, which is a good. But then you can perhaps import the blueprint or the software needed to actually print, and that will be a service in the context of the measurement of digital trade. So I think Lee is absolutely right that many of these new technologies will be brought into one way or another through licenses or royalties or whatever in trade. But I think you will still have challenges, Lee, in identifying these specific technologies in as separate items in the trade context.
Well, I guess I'm thinking that things like IoT basically is a data transmission service, and it would be found there. You would have things like cloud services is a data storage service, but the cloud enabling technologies are basically integrated into many communications or IT services. It's fungible. And you could go on and on, that many of these technologies end up being supplied to end users who then integrate them in, but the origin is a service supplier who makes the technology available to the users who then are the enabled ones. I guess that's the point I was trying. You think of a lot of the technologies, and certainly to be created, there's patents, but then they're sold by somebody, made available on the market as a IT service in many cases. So I think they'd be counted often there.
Well, yeah, in our case, all these things are, because we're giving this very wide definition, we are taking into account all those issues. We have entries on 3D printers because 3D printers cannot really work without using online service. It's you have to use something, you have to use a blueprint and start from something online. We have a cloud, we have IoT restrictions on IoT, so we're trying to take this into account as much as possible. Well, I'll just leave quickly the floor to each of the speakers, just if you have any concluding remark. Shall we go in the same order? Maybe Geoffrey, you have anything to add?
No, nothing more to add. Many thanks to you for the invitation, and also to colleagues for the great discussion that we had today.
Thank you, and we look forward to see the data published. Torbjörn?
Yes, a big thank you for organizing the call, and good luck with the rest of the work on the index.
Thanks. Shamira, you also had your hands raised. I don't know if you have anything to add.
No, Torbjörn actually covered a lot of what I wanted to say about endowments and existing ecosystems. Like, for example, things you might take for granted in more developed countries, or like in Europe, we actually don't have those existing enablers and things you take for granted. Like, that's what digital trade is. So maybe having more developmental considerations in terms of overlapping priorities, financial inclusion, digital ID, connectivity, access, infrastructure, et cetera, And yeah, just once again, it's quite a lot of fascinating work. And so far, because I have read the previous methodology, I've seen you made a lot of progress, and I must commend you on the work you're doing. And yeah, thank you for the opportunity to participate. Thank you.
Thanks, Shamira. Tunde?
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Well done for the work, for version 2, because I know you have to get this out and keep moving as mentioned. Please do take into account the informal economy and the micro, small and medium businesses. And I know finding indicators are challenging, but it can be done. Thank you.
Thanks. Well, I wanted to thank you all for the comments and for all the suggestions. We have a lot of food for thought. This webinar probably is the webinar with most suggestions for our methodology. So we definitely take your comments into account, and you will see how our index evolves thanks to your comments and contributions. And I think the objective of this meeting was really to have an African perspective, and we definitely got a development perspective, which is very important, and we will definitely take this into account in the index. So thank you all. The meeting has been recorded, so it will also be published if you want to watch it again. And also on our webpage of the project, we have a mailing list in case you want to remain updated about the release of the index, the next meetings, and so on. So feel free to sign up if you want to receive more invites to this kind of webinars. Thanks again to everybody, and have a nice afternoon.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Take care.
Cheers.
Thank you.